All right, hi everybody. Did anybody just come from the other accessibility talk on the other side? Nice, it was really good, right? Super cool. Everyone that I attend gives me more ideas from mine, so I guess I'm lucky to be going last. So I guess I'll get started then. Thank you all for coming. My name is Marco. I'm talking a little bit about specifically why we need human involvement in the process of making our products accessible. So before I get into it, a little bit about myself. I am a front-end developer at Infotech. Thank you, Infotech, for sponsoring me coming here. I've been at it for about 2.5 years. I'm like early enough in my career that I can say 2.5, and that's like significant. And accessibility is one of the things that I've really made a priority as I learn, how to be a front-end developer. And so I've taken the opportunity to, really push it with my colleagues and also here with all of you guys. And fortunately, we're a company that makes these things a priority, and so I don't have a lot of, I don't have any pushback. It's just a collaborative, experience. That being said, that's the last time I'm going to talk about my company, because everything from here on out is my own opinions. So totally separate from them. This is all me, right? And of course, I'm not an expert. I'm still pretty early on in things. So I've really tried to zero in on one particular issue that I think I can speak to pretty strongly. And I hope that it helps everybody understand accessibility a little bit more and hopefully have more ammunition when you're talking about it with other people. Because I'm sure you all care very much if you're here, and so I'm really glad to have you. So to get started, I want to paint a picture for you of the current situation and why accessibility is ultimately always going to be a human problem, right? So accessibility doesn't just mean that your site or your product is screen reader friendly, right? The goal is to enable all of your users to have an equal experience, not the inequivalent experience, but equal access, right? There's lots of different assistive technologies and a lot of different disabilities that affect how somebody can interact with your products. And this goal is really important because, well, it's required of us, right? The ADA requires that basically if you're a business and you do business on the internet, you have to make sure that your stuff is accessible, right? The web is a public space, and public spaces have to be accessible. Not only that, but your internal tools have to be accessible too, because your employees need to have accommodations for any disabilities they may have. And so if you're making internal tools, this still applies to you as well. If you're a back-end developer, maybe not quite as much, but it still all comes together to make this really important cohesive whole. So we're all aware of this. And we have this standard that is not necessarily officially the standard, but it's the one that everybody sort of relies on. These are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, right? They sort of lay out how to be compliant and how to make your products accessible. But that being said, it's not the most simple document to parse. It's broken down into 4 main principles, and those are broken down into 13 guidelines. And then those guidelines are defined in 73 success criteria. And those criteria are not prescriptive. They don't give you a specific way of solving them, right? It's very subjective, and it really comes down to the experience that a user will have when using your product. So it's hard to sort of nail down the specifics of how to meet these success criteria, and even the experts often disagree about how precisely to do that. The guidelines are about 35 pages long. It's a very technical document, but thankfully they have lots of supplementary documents, how to meet WCAG, how to understand it, some techniques and failures, right? But those documents are still pretty complicated, and cumulatively, it's like 2,000 pages printed of documentation. And obviously that's pretty daunting for somebody who is new to accessibility. They know that they have to do it, but they don't know how, and so, these problems arise when you don't have guidance or leadership to help you figure it out. And they're really putting the fire under these companies because, especially in recent years, lawsuits relating to accessibility issues are increasing at a rapid pace, right? Just in the past 4 years, the number of lawsuits filed related to accessibility has almost doubled, and I have it on good authority that this year is going to be a much larger number as well. Not only that, but pretty much every major company has received at least one accessibility-related lawsuit because basically every major company is failing to make their stuff accessible in some way or another. Some are better than others, but it doesn't paint a pretty picture at the moment, right? So I'm not going to guilt anybody in this talk, and I'm certainly not going to preach to you about accessibility. You all understand why it's needed. And there's a lot of reasons why we in our work might not be able to reach that, idyllic goal of having everything be totally accessible all the time. But for a lot of companies that don't know where to begin, there are a lot of products out there that promise a lot to them and sort of assuage those fears about how to solve this problem. And they advertise with, marketing material like this. They say, you just pay a monthly fee, a known quantity. You spend a couple minutes adding their scripts to your site, and they will take care of the rest, and you will be compliant. And they make a point of mentioning all those standards that define what is accessible, and they offer you a solution that's so easy. It's just, pay a little bit of money, put their stuff in, and they'll handle the rest for you. And you don't ever have to think about it ever again. At least that's what they're seeing. And it's easy to see why this is appealing, right? Even if you do care, if you feel daunted, if you feel, intimidated by this whole process, or if you're a company that just doesn't want to get sued, and you want to make the problem go away, this is the way to go, right? But of course, as you probably already know, and if not, you can imagine, it's really not it's not possible. It's not nearly that simple. And to explain more about why that is, there's an analogy that I think is really apt that I'm going to come back to throughout this talk. And it's the fact that accessibility is like testing in a lot of different ways. So just to start off, how do we think about testing, right? It's one of those things that we all know that we have to do it. Nobody's ever going to question the fact that every piece of code we write should be properly tested, It's not our favorite thing to do. It can be hard. It can be frustrating. We can kind of put it off, especially if we're on a time crunch, It's one of those things that gets put to the end and might even get a little bit rushed. And, I'm sure nobody here has ever released code that wasn't tested properly. But a friend might have told you that, their company really made it hard for them and they ended up having to do something a bit unsavory, right? And that's not great. And we agree it's not great. But one of the things that we try to do to solve all of these feelings is we try to automate away as much of it as we can. But we can agree then that there's a lot of similarities here in how many of you probably think about accessibility. But let me ask you a few other questions about testing, and hopefully you would say no to all of these things, right? I don't think that anybody here would willingly compromise the quality of their testing if there was a way for them to solve it. I don't think that you would accept the fact that the business that you join doesn't really care about testing and doesn't think it's necessary. If you had the ability to change that, you probably would, right? Even if it's not your favorite thing to do. And also, even if you're not an expert in testing, you would still do as much as you're capable of and try and figure out how to solve the rest of those problems later. You wouldn't just give up entirely on doing it, right? So I'm going to assume that we all agree on these things, and I'm going to ask one last question. Would you be willing to let an automated tool automatically audit and test your code for you? Write all of the tests, assure you that all the testing is done and that it's good quality and that everything works. Is that something you think you would trust? Do you think that an AI or machine learning or something like that could successfully do something like that? at least in our current year of 2022? Probably not. Do you think it's ever going to be possible? Probably not. As long as humans are writing the code, I don't think machines are going to be able to write the tests. They can verify they work. That's really useful. But they can't write them for you. And the same thing goes for accessibility. It can't be automated. And so these services, like the one that I showed before, they make a lot of promises, but they can't really keep them, in my opinion. You know, testing requires you to understand the context of the code that you wrote. You know, why it's there, how it's meant to work, what you expect it to do. And an automated tool couldn't hope to understand all of that because it would have to understand how you built it, right? You know, we have tools like GitHub Copilot that just came out. Has anybody used that? Okay, nobody here has even used it, so I can't ask if you like it, but you know, it's something that seems cool in theory, but I don't think you would trust it to write the code for you. Same idea there. And that ultimately is the problem here. People want this one-click solution to accessibility, especially if they have an existing product that they're just now getting around to trying to make compliant. And while this offer seems appealing, I think you can see how machine learning isn't quite there yet in terms of trying to do this all for you. And in reality, as many people in the disabled community, if you want to call it that, would tell you, these solutions can make things a lot worse. They can make the website harder to use, unfamiliar. They can mess things up in really surprising ways. And if you've never used any assistive technologies on your own website or on your own product, then you might have no idea just how much of a hassle this thing can be, right? And they really do make a lot of really strong promises. I have excluded names in all of this promotional material, but these are some of the most popular and well-known accessibility overlay services. And they really promise that you can scale up infinitely without basically any effort on your part. They have their AIs that will just fix everything for you. They'll intelligently pick up on stuff. They'll fix them. I particularly am bothered by like these little graphics here referring to all of the different standards that you might encounter, because they're not explicitly saying, we guarantee this is going to work and it's going to meet all these standards, but the way that they're depicted, you know, you kind of assume that. And if you ever said so, they'd be like, well, we didn't say that it would handle it for you. We just put a little graphic with a check mark and a name there, you know? It meant that we were aware of them, that, you know, our software takes it into account. I was really struck by the fact that one of them said that the FCC's website uses their service. You would hope that, you know, an organization like that would know better, but here we are. They also put a big emphasis on, upper right here, that they'll help you with lawsuits if they come. You know, they have like copy ready to go. They have teams of lawyers who will, you know, presumably help make the problem go away. They don't say that explicitly, but that's what you take from it. And some of them also offer, you know, services that allow you to remediate the problems yourself. And that is a little bit better, but ultimately, there's a fundamental problem with this. The idea that you can take these problems and turn them into a beautiful little checklist, and you can just tick items off as you go and fix everything, is not really the right way to think about it, because a machine can't even identify all of the issues in the first place. And as we said before, the requirements are not things that you can always quantify, right? So I know that we as engineers like to have a list of tasks that we can go through and individually complete, and then at the end we can say we've completed it. But when dealing with accessibility, not only are the solutions not, you know, yes or no, it's fixed or it's not fixed, but it's an ongoing process. And even when you've completed all of those tasks, there's still work to be done. There's places where you can make it better. And creating these very prescriptive pieces of software, I think, frames the problem in a way that's a little bit dangerous to creating that right mindset. And as you can imagine, as a result, despite the claims that these companies make about what an amazing impact they have, the reality is not quite as crystal clear as they would make it out to be. The people who are actually impacted by these issues, they hate these things, and they say that it makes the internet more opaque and less accessible for them. And at the end of the day, if that's what the people who really matter in this problem say, then can we really argue with that? I don't think so. So it really just won't work. Machine learning can't understand the intent and the context behind the content that we put on our websites, right? Because in order to properly explain the intent of this thing, you need to have a bigger picture view that, these neural networks are not given. They don't get that context. They get the image, they get metadata, for example, for alt text, but they don't necessarily know what kind of website is it on? What is the purpose of the page? Is this a product listing? Is this an article with a header image? All of these things affect the way that you might explain what that content is, what it means. We don't want to set a precedent that what a computer vision algorithm outputs is good enough, right? Because they're going to produce a certain kind of result that it's not human, right? And that should not be good enough for our users who rely on tools like screen readers in order to use our site. Would you trust a computer vision algorithm to provide captions for your product images on your e-commerce site? Do you trust that they're going to properly label all of the things that you're selling? We'll look at that in just a second. But when you think about it, we already can understand that we can't even test for compliance. So if you can't even detect the problems in the first place, how would these programs ever be able to fix it? It's like saying, to go back to the analogy of testing, that, oh, our code is fully tested. We know that because it says we have 100% code coverage. Is that good enough to say that your code is tested properly? Probably not. Not only that, but it does bear mentioning that using these third-party services is handing over sensitive data belonging to your most vulnerable users to third parties that will surely have terms of service that allow them to then take that data and package it and sell it and collect more information about people who already struggle enough trying to use the internet. Don't need to worry about this as well. To look at a couple examples. Again, this is in reference to one of the services we've talked about, who, as part of their advertising material, shows their AI identifying product images, right? And these images here are examples that were provided as part of evidence entered into a lawsuit against one of the users of the service up here. I'm being intentionally vague with names, but if you follow the source, you can read all more about it if it interests you. So as a quick exercise, if you'll humor me, I would like to hear a suggestion for how you might caption each of these images in a way that makes sense, right? Let's start with the wedding dress. Can someone suggest alt text for it?
White lace A-line wedding dress.
Sure, white lace A-line wedding dress. Pretty darn good, right? That is a piece of nuance that I would not have picked up on, and that's why you need domain experts to, do the work. Well, more of an expert than I am anyway. But anyway, this service did provide automated alt text for this image, and what it landed on was, quote, grass, nature, and summer.
Oh. It's accurate.
Which, strictly speaking, it's not untrue, but it's not exactly the most useful caption, is it? What about like these face masks down here? Just really quick, rapid fire, first thing that comes to your head.
Floral face.
Pretty good. Floral face mask. Yeah, like that's good. That's certainly on the right track. And I don't know if I'm qualified to say whether it's perfect, but it's good. What the service ended up captioning this image was, quote, BTS-2. So what happened here was it wasn't able to really identify what's going on in this image because, you know, it's something that it hasn't seen so often, although maybe now it probably should have seen this pretty often, but maybe at the time, right? And so because it couldn't identify any objects in the scene, it fell back on the metadata and it looked at the file name to try and find some useful information to put into the caption. Obviously, that's not really very useful, but it's the best that it can do. How about the phone charging stand over there?
Phone charging.
Sure, phone charging stand. I don't know if that would necessarily be descriptive enough so that a user really knew what they were getting. So there's improvements to be made there, but that's on the right track, again, right? What it ended up producing when you apply the accessibility overlay was, quote, prod image. What happened here is that there was some developer had put in alt text themselves. They put in the word prod image for the alt text for that image, and when the AI scans it, it sees that a human has already provided something, and so it doesn't touch it. It leaves it as it is, which obviously is not fixing the problem with accessibility in this situation. And I can understand why you wouldn't want to overwrite the alt text that a human being put in there, right? I can imagine that being kind of annoying. But obviously in this case, the problem is not solved. And that kind of goes against what they say their software is able to do. Now, there are useful things you can do with this. You know, you can use it for indexing searches, right? If I searched for nature and summer, maybe I would want to see this dress show up in the results. But that's not enough for the purpose of accessibility. These services also offer the same kind of thing for adding tab indexes to menus so that you can navigate with the keyboard. And you can imagine what the user experience is for things like that as well. I think a good analogy, a picture that I really like is this here. If you took this AI and asked it to make these stairs accessible, it would do something like this, which is, strictly speaking, correct in that there is a ramp that a wheelchair user could use. But if you asked a human to make a wheelchair ramp in these stairs, would they do it like that? Probably not, because that looks kind of uncomfortable to use. If it's even compliant, because it might be too steep with the way it's laid out. Not really the point, but this is the kind of thing that you run into with these services. So it just doesn't work. Before I continue as to what we can do about it instead, I do want to point out too that accessibility really is something that benefits everybody. Now, we are not, well, I can't assume anything about my audience, but it benefits everybody even if you don't consider yourself to have a disability. First of all, your user base is more diverse than you think it is. I think this statistic is really interesting that in a 2015 survey from the National Center for Education Statistics, 19% of undergraduate students self-identified as having a disability. And that was a pretty consistent number across gender, race, orientation, everything. So if your product targets college-aged adults or younger people, there's a good chance that at least 10-20% of your audience might have a disability. Obviously, not all of those will impact the way that they use the web or they use software in general, but it's not an insignificant number. And even if it was 1 or 2%, it still would be worthwhile and necessary to address. But just so you don't think that it's a small minority. And also, a lot of these accessibility improvements are just good design, right? They make the website more pleasant to use for everybody. Does anybody here have eye strain? Have you ever done that, like, I don't want to say old person thing, but where you like bring the phone up to your face and pick up your glasses, you know? Maybe your parents do that and not you. That's fine. But a lot of improvements to things like color contrast, offering dark mode for a website. I mean, how many people here use dark mode on any of their services? I have a browser extension that makes every website dark mode because I love it so much. Those are all things that were intended for accessibility, but they benefit you too, and you appreciate the fact that they're there, even though you might not necessarily notice if they were missing. One day you might. I don't want anybody to ponder their own mortality right now. It's not the goal of my presentation. And I said I wouldn't try to guilt anybody, right? So it's fine. But also, like, if you have wrist pain, carpal tunnel, maybe some of you suffer from that. Certainly it's a programmer disease or something you see a lot. Or does anyone use Vim here? Anybody a big fan of Vim? So you guys are like allergic to using the mouse, right? You want to do everything with your keyboard. If all the websites you used were really keyboard accessible, then you wouldn't have to use the mouse ever again for anything. So you're getting a big benefit from it too. And again, I do need to stress that this is not the reason why we do accessibility, but it's something to point out in terms of the user experience and how it impacts a lot of people. You know, power users are kind of a minority of your user base, but you still probably would appreciate the fact that they have a good experience, right? The difference, of course, is that for you, not having these enhancements is at best an inconvenience, but for people who actually rely on them, it's the difference between them using your product or not, whether they want to or not. So it's necessary. I don't think that anybody here would deny it, but this is something important that you can talk about when people are looking for the business justification for doing accessibility. It shouldn't be necessary, but it's a good point to make. And ultimately, you can do it way better than any tool can, right? It's just like any other skill that a developer has to learn. It's really subjective, as I said. Experts don't always agree on how to do things. I mean, the actual conventions for writing alt text are so subjective, and two people are going to produce two radically different types of captions, and they might argue viciously on Twitter about which one is the better approach. That's fine. That is the level of pedantry that we would like to have, you know, among all developers when it comes to these things. The thing that also you can keep in mind is that your website is only compliant if it meets all of the success criteria. Whether you have 500 errors or 1 error, it's still not compliant in terms of legal issues, okay? And that does suck if you are on the receiving end of a lawsuit. But the fact of the matter is that in between 500 and 1, your website or your product is getting much more pleasant to use, much more usable for the people who actually rely on this stuff, right? So making that effort, fixing all the low-hanging fruit, and then working your way up to these more complex subjects that are harder to understand, you're making your stuff better along the way. It's not an all or nothing thing. And so it's going to be hard, it's going to take a long time, but the journey is going to be worthwhile all along the way. And that's really important. Another important thing is that the guidelines, like WCAG, are only going to get stricter over time. And the enforcement, whether that be from the government or via lawsuits, is only going to increase more over time as well. Just in the next couple of years, we're probably going to see WCAG 3.0, a new set of guidelines come out. In a lot of ways, it's going to be better because it's meant to be more approachable, more legible for non-experts. But on the other hand, it's going to cover a broader range of disabilities and issues, and it's going to require additional effort on the part of all developers. And so by not working on it now, you're creating tech debt, accessibility debt, that's going to only grow more over time. And you don't want to wait until the lawsuits come piling in before you start trying to fix those problems, because the pile is just getting bigger over time, you know? So doing this creates momentum. This graphic is from a really great pamphlet that I'm going to plug at the end. So stand by for that. But this is really the crux of the issue, right? Is that it's nice, the idea that a one-click tool can fix all of your problems. But if you just get started, if you try to create momentum within your company for this issue, it's going to only get better over time. And the initial step of getting that ball rolling is difficult, and maybe not all of you have the sway to effect change at a high level, which is where it needs to come from. But you can make efforts on an individual level for yourself, and then within your team, and then within the people who you report to, and work your way up. And while that might not be the optimal way to do it, it's going to make a difference over time. And also, it does bear mentioning that while tools can't solve all your problems, they are really useful in the process of actually doing accessibility. This is just a small selection of things that I've personally used in my time so far. You know, Google Lighthouse is not really an accessibility tool, but it's really easy to integrate into our CI/CD pipelines, so we can have that automated testing as we go. And yeah, it's not going to catch even the majority of issues that our site might have, but it's going to give us a framework to ensure that our commits and our releases are accessible as they go out, instead of going back and fixing them later. There's a couple really great browser tools. I use Andy here a lot. It's just like a bookmarklet that you can click and activate whenever you're on a page. Use it to evaluate a lot of different things. Axe is pretty much one of the gold standards in terms of accessibility tools. These are really useful. I mean, they help you catch so many different things. And I would never say that a human should only use their own mind to try and solve problems. Just like testing, the tools make it easier. They make it more efficient, and they allow our efforts to go farther. So obviously, you want to use tools. You just don't want to rely on them to pull all of the weight for you. I think in particular, this was a really interesting image or example. This is from a different accessibility service that does not promise to fix all of your problems for you, but it talks about the fact that they can use machine learning to identify components in your UI and guide you through the process of examining them and checking different things that are often missed or often done wrong. So this is a really interesting way of using those technologies that we've been, kind of roasting for the past 30 minutes and use them to assist you in doing the work that a machine wouldn't be able to do on its own. So there are ways to use these things to great effect. It's just that you have to pick the companies that are doing it right. And I've kind of already said this, but I encourage everybody here to advocate for this as much as they can at their own companies, right? It's sort of like a bottom-up and top-down thing that should be going on, right? You need to have vocal support from the decision makers at your company. And I don't think there are any CEOs in the room right now, but if there are, definitely get on that. But if you have any kind of, clout at your company that you're willing to throw towards this cause, I would encourage you to do so. I'm working on developing that so that in a few years' time, maybe I can throw it around a little bit myself. But as I said, I know that maybe I'm coming in with a pretty idyllic image of how these things go, but you can start to affect change within your own bubble and help it grow over time. That's the best that I can really ask anybody to attempt and do right now. If you are new to accessibility, or there are people you know who are new to it who want somewhere to get started, this pamphlet is about an hour read. It's really fantastic. It's very candid. It's very casual. It's got lots of great visuals, and it makes a great case for why we need to do it. It doesn't teach you how to do accessibility, but it teaches you what you should know as someone who's going to start practicing it very soon. If you care about certifications, the Department of Homeland Security has this certification, the Trusted Tester. This teaches you the basics of the WCAG guidelines and how to look at websites or products and evaluate them, which is going to be really useful during if you're in a design review or you want to evaluate your own software, it gives you a framework to test it that will be supplemented by some of the tools that you might use. And the IAAP is basically like, I don't want to call it the governing body, but it is an organization that has really rigorous certifications, including the Certified Professional in Accessibility Core Competencies. These are really serious. Oh yeah, by the way, the Trusted Tester cert is free, completely free class online. These, of course, are paid for, but they are much more thorough, and they're really for people who want to become experts in this domain. So if that's you, then that's somebody to check out if for some reason you haven't heard of them already. But really, learning how to evaluate a site is something I would recommend everybody do, because now that you've learned why tools can't do it for us, you need to know how to do it right. And again, this pamphlet, so good. If you didn't already write down the URL, scan it right now, check it out. If you're on YouTube, hopefully you can see that and you can scan it, check it out. It's really, really great. Send it to all your friends, print it out, throw it at people, I don't know, everything. It's fantastic. But that's pretty much all I have for you today. So thank you everybody for listening. And